Yeah,
Annie.
Sorry, my mute button wasn't working. So China's a little different. Today we're going to talk about some of the kind of potential current violation of human rights. The history of China is very complex, especially in the past century or so. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but it is really important to know. So, further research, talk about it with people who might know more. So basically, I went to China not this past summer, but the summer before. So when I went to China, I was ready for a lot of differences. I knew I was going to have to adjust to a lot of different things. Food, culture, language. But I didn't realize I was going to have to adjust to technology differences as well. So one of you guys mentioned kind of freedom and access to technology, which is really great thing to think about, and try to think about that as I'm talking about China. Because in China, what I was kind of surprised to find was that a lot of sites that we use, a lot of internet sites that we use here, are blocked in China. That includes Facebook, that includes Google search engine, Google Docs, Google Maps, anything with Google is blocked. You can't use it in China. Twitter is blocked, YouTube is blocked, even Snapchat and Instagram. And then there's other sites as well. So the Chinese government has decided that they don't think that the Chinese citizens should be using these sites. So just a little bit of background about China. The history of China, as I said, is very complex. They are a communist nation, or the Communist Party is in charge, in control of the country. They came to power in the 1950s, around that time. And so there's been a series of arguments of violation of human rights throughout that time. It's very complicated, a lot of issues. And at one point, even people weren't allowed to leave the country. And so we've been talking some about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is the international document that was created by the United Nations that kind of states basic rights and fundamental freedoms to all human beings that we're all entitled to. And so one of them is the freedom of movement, being able to go where you want to go. So in that case, China was definitely violating one of basic human rights. But they started to open the country up more. They used to not really want to do foreign trade. They wouldn't let a lot of foreigners come into the country. But they started to open themselves up in the past few decades. So the internet arrived in China in January 1996. So that was pretty exciting. There weren't really any blocked websites at that point. But China first started to systematically block foreign websites in August of 1996. So just about 6 months later. That's actually where, so if any of you guys have heard the Great Wall of China, that massive wall in China, it's one of the world's most famous landmarks. So what they call, the reason the sites that are blocked in China, it's called the Great Firewall of China, because the firewall is something that will block kind of sites you don't want to see or aren't allowed to see in China. And that was actually created by a US magazine. So the system, they first started blocking them in 1996, but it didn't really become as developed and as intense as it is now until the early 2000s. So one of the first sites that was really prominent sites that was blocked was Google. So in September 2002, Google was blocked, and then from there it kind of went downhill. So YouTube was actually blocked in 2008 after there was unrest in Tibet. So there were protests and conflicts and criticisms of the Chinese government. So China just blocked the website so that the general public couldn't have access to YouTube and see what was going on. And then Facebook and Twitter were blocked in 2009. And this was in large part because there were riots happening in the province. And in that case as well, they're criticizing the Chinese government, expressing their own views. And the Chinese government didn't want them to be able to have this communication and really incite riots and incite these protests. So that's in part why they blocked it. So another universal human right is freedom of expression and opinion. So think about that the more as I talk about kind of access to the internet, because it could be argued that China is violating currently their citizens' right to expression and right to opinion by limiting what sites they're allowed to see. So the Great Firewall of China, it's not a physical barrier. It's not preventing people to leave. Chinese citizens can come and go, but it's more of a virtual one. So it's, as the Communist Party says, it's preventing information harmful to the Communist Party from entering the country. So anything the Communist Party thinks that, and the Communist Party is the party that's in charge of China at this point in time. So anything the Communist Party thinks is harmful to their narrative, harmful to the image of the Communist Party, it's going to be blocked. And so in the past, China used to be a little defensive about like a censorship record because this is censorship. They're deciding what their population can have access to, can see, so they're censoring the information. So China used to be a little defensive because they've been criticized in the past for censorship, for too much government control, but they're now kind of proud, or they're kind of trumpeting their experience or their censorship of the internet and calling it a vision of internet sovereignty. And they want it to be kind of a model for the rest of the world, and kind of making it a legal reality at home and throughout the world. And so why, in part, why this is so important, in part censorship, question of universal rights, also internet usage. So while it's restricted and while they can't get on sites, internet is still used throughout China. There are nearly 700 million users in China that use the internet. That's a massive amount of people that use the internet. So it's not that they don't have access to the internet, it's just what they have access to is limited. But the amount of people that are using the internet in China means that 1 in 4 of the world's population that uses the internet is behind the Great Firewall. So 1 in 4 of people that are on the internet, that are surfing the web and whatnot, have restricted access to it. So if we're looking at universal human rights, everyone on the internet doesn't have the same right, the same information online. So what kind of the Chinese government says, it's this kind of balance of freedom and order and like openness and autonomy. So it's kind of this governance on throughout the web. So it's not just, you don't have complete freedom online. They still want to maintain order. And they think that's necessary in their country. So they call it the golden shield. So it's this giant mechanism of censorship and also surveillance that blocks tens of thousands of websites that are deemed harmful to the Communist Party's narrative and control. So that includes, as I said, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram. So there's kind of like 2 parts to that. First, the Chinese government isn't just censoring, isn't just blocking sites that the Chinese population can access. They're also implementing surveillance as well. So they are using cyber security, cyber surveillance to monitor what people are using. So if people go on illegal websites, there's been instances of Chinese journalists, Chinese dissidents, or people that aren't happy with the Chinese government posting things online or expressing their views. And the Chinese government will see that and they might arrest them, they might reprimand them. So what you say online is monitored by the Chinese government as well. It's not just that they're not allowed to see certain things, they're not allowed to say certain things as well. So that's another aspect to kind of the violation of freedom of expression and opinion. So they block tens of thousands of websites that are harmful to the Communist Party's narrative and control. So the Communist Party is deciding what they want to be perceived as, what they want their population to understand, and kind of they're constructing their own narrative of kind of the outside world. Because on the one hand, Chinese government says, oh, we want to be globally, we want to have access to the global world, we want to be global citizens. But on the other hand, the party is also saying, well, we only want these certain things. We still want to be in control. So that's a little complicated. So in April, this past April in 2016, the US government actually officially classified the Great Wall of China, the Golden Shield, as a barrier to trade, noting that 8 of the 25 most trafficked, so most visited sites globally, were now blocked in China. So the American Chamber of Commerce in China says that 4 out of 5 of its member companies report a negative impact on their business from internet censorship. So it's not just influencing the population, it's influencing outside businesses. So China is not just censoring their own people, but it's censoring basically any company that's in China as well. And they're actually expected to up their cybersecurity as well, to approve a new law that we're going to that's going to strengthen its control of the internet. And this might be problematic in the future. And they're arguing that they're going to do this to keep out harmful ideas without damaging the nation's global connectivity. So they want this, potentially it's kind of contradictory, because on the one hand, they want a global connectivity, but they also want to keep out harmful ideas. So there's this kind of, it doesn't really necessarily make sense to at least some people, because if it's global connectivity, you want to have access to all information, you want to be able to talk to people, communicate with people, share different ideas. But China's government saying that, on the one hand, yeah, we want to be globally connected, but we want to control how people are connected. So when I was in China, there's actually a few ways to get around the Great Firewall of China. You can use a VPN, which stands for a virtual private network. So when I was in China, I had this little app on my computer, and I would click it, and it would connect to an internet site in New York or in LA. And so my computer would think I was in the US, and so I'd be able to get on sites that are available in the US. So the Chinese government actually knows about these sites, and they've accepted that it exists, in large part because that's how a lot of foreign businesses can do business in China, is being able to have access to these other sites and be able to connect to American sites. But they're starting to crack down a little more. There was this quote from this quote is like the czar of like internet control in China. This is, they're willing to tolerate a certain amount of porousness in the Great Walls, so a certain amount of holes, a certain amount of like little loopholes within it, as long as they feel ultimately if they need to exert control, they can. So the Chinese Communist Party is more interested in what ordinary people are reading, so the general public, than what the globally minded elite might encounter on the web. So they weren't really worried about me coming in and using a VPN because I'm from the US, I was going back to the US. So if I was accessing sites like Facebook, like I would be going back to Facebook after. But even so, if I had posted something that was problematic to the narrative of the Communist Party, they would shut it down. I actually had a friend who posted something, I guess slightly criticizing something about the government, and her Facebook was shut down because they monitor what's happening. So that's also kind of problematic. She didn't have freedom of expression or opinion there as well. So one little last thing, as I said, I'm not going too in depth and too in detail about the Chinese government. But it's very complicated, the history of China in the past century. There have been a lot of issues. There's been a lot of different situations. So, and I don't want to, as we talked about last class, I don't want to give you guys just a single story, a snapshot that kind of complicates your understanding, or that all Chinese, the government's bad, and it's really complicated. But there is one thing that's interesting. It's just a slight example. So Google isn't accessible. You can't get on Google in China. They have a few other search engines that you can use, like Baidu. And so if you type in certain things on that website, it might, or in the search engine, things might not show up. So for instance, in 1989, there were a bunch of student protests in Tiananmen Square. You guys may have heard of this, sometimes called the Tiananmen Square Massacre or the Tiananmen Square protests. So a group of students were kind of worried. They wanted political, economic reform. They were worried about the direction of their country. So they staged this big protest, this big kind of strike. They were all in this big square, and the government, after kind of failed negotiations, decided to take military force. And so they sent in the military, they sent in tanks, and people died. We actually don't know how many people died because the Chinese government, they released a number saying I think about 200, but some people have estimated up to over 1,000 people died. We honestly don't know because access to information. But there is this image of this man when the tanks were coming in to kind of stop the protests. And he's known as the Tiananmen tank man. He actually stood in front of a line of 5 tanks and didn't move. And they kept trying to get around him, and he kept moving in front of the tanks. So some people argue that he saved a lot of lives just by putting himself in front of the tanks. And eventually they got him to move. But this one man stood in front of these tanks and said, "I'm not moving. This shouldn't be happening." So no one really knows who he is, but it's a very powerful, very moving image. But if you look it up on the Chinese search engine, it won't show up. If you look up Tiananmen Square, which is a big touristy site in China, if you look it up, it'll come up with cool tourist things of Tiananmen Square. If you look up Tiananmen Square Massacre, nothing will come up. If you look up Tiananmen Tank Man, nothing will come up. So that's an example of the censorship. That's an example of kind of the Chinese government monitoring and deciding what the population can see and can experience. So it's really interesting and it's complex. It doesn't mean that the Chinese government or the Chinese population is cut off completely from the rest of the world. As I said, over 700 million people in China use the internet, which is a massive number. But they still have limited access in some situations. They still are up to date on news worldwide and whatnot, but if there's like certain protests, certain things that complicate or threaten the communist narrative, that's when it might be censored. That's when they might not have access to it. So in the case of China, the internet is as much a tool for control and surveillance and commercial considerations as it is for empowerment. So to this day, it can be argued that China is violating some of the universal declaration, like the universal rights that are listed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because they're violating issues such as freedom of expression and opinion.
Awesome. Awesome. So now we're gonna, sorry about that. Just sort of reflect on a little bit what we've talked about today. I know that was a lot of information, but sort of, sorry, to discuss what we talked about. We have a few sort of questions for you guys you can think about and then come up if you have any answers. So just sort of in general, what do you guys think of the differences in rights that we discussed today in the presentation? So between Spain and Italy, which have sort of this history where they didn't really have as many human rights, and now they've sort of are more similar to the US versus China, which still has a lot of restrictions, especially on internet usage. Do you think these are just or unjust, and why or why not? So go ahead and just sort of take a minute to think about that, and then if a few people want to come up and share what they're thinking about. And there's no sort of right or wrong answer to this. We just sort of want to know what you guys think about it and sort of see how you guys compare it to what we have in the US. So once you guys have thought about it for a few minutes, if maybe like a couple people want to come up and share what they think or have, if they have thoughts they want to share with everyone. Or if there's anything that you learned today that surprised you guys or that you didn't know before, that's another thing to think about.
Hey, at my table we talked about how it was super surprising about the internet in China because here we're like so used to the internet. It's like probably every hour I'm on the internet except for when I'm sleeping. But it's really surprising. So yeah.
Yeah, awesome. That's a great point, and that's definitely something that's really different between the U.S. and other places. Awesome. Anyone else?
Hi, our table just kind of talked about how in most of these cases where it's like cutting on free speech and stuff, it's mostly about the government wanting control over the people. Like they want to be able to make sure that they won't be thrown out of power or anything, that the people don't know enough to be able to do anything about it. And then they also do things to scare them so that they won't try and, overthrow the government or anything. So yeah, it's mostly about controlling the flow of information to make sure that they can keep the control and be in power and such. It's just, yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because that's something you saw in Spain and Italy, is they were trying to, the dictators were trying to keep their power, and that's sort of in China too, the Communist Party is sort of trying to maintain the power. So that's a really good point. Anyone else? Those are really good ideas so far.
Yeah. I didn't know she read it. So my name is Harris. And I think if you look at the reason why they censor, like, what their people can see is because they want to maintain power. So like they don't want to look bad, and so I guess particularly it makes it so that it's sort of counterproductive because now their people, like, because of the lack of trade of ideas, yes, they can't really innovate.
Yeah, that's a good point. So it's sometimes maybe these restrictions can be counterproductive too. Awesome. Yeah. So those are all really good ideas. And we can tell that you guys are definitely thinking about what we were saying and everything. So that's awesome. Does anyone else have anything they want to add before Annie sort of wraps it up? All right.
Okay, great. So those are all really good points, guys. Really good job. So basically, in closing, it's important to remember that not all countries have the same definition of human rights, and or not all countries or not all governments want to allow those rights. You guys talked about using the restriction of rights to maintain power, which to an extent is really true in a lot of countries. So in China, to this day, as a way in which they keep control of their government or their country is through this censorship. The Communist Party wants to stay in power, so they monitor anything that threatens the narrative, threatens the power of the Communist Party. And so people are still criticizing, people still are upset about it and complain about it. Sometimes they have to leave the country and flee the country. Sometimes they're just kind of like slapped on the wrist and told that so that they stop doing that kind of thing from the government. Sometimes they're arrested. Sometimes they're never seen again. So there's these complications, and it's not just something that happened in the 1940s when we talk about like Mussolini and Franco. There's a lot of violations of human rights, of kind of questionable human rights activities that are happening to this day. So just because we have this great universal declaration of human rights created by the UN does not mean that everyone in the world still has access to the same rights. So just with like internet access alone, there was a study that basically looked at kind of level of access to internet. So some countries like the US, like Australia, like most of Western Europe, they have complete free access to internet. But on the other hand, there is restricted access, very restricted. You have countries like China, like Russia, like Egypt, that are being censored, that are being restricted, and also a level of surveillance that's happening. And it's also important to think about and consider, like looking forward, looking at our presidential election, looking at debates and issues of kind of cybersecurity. We've had a lot of issues, questions about that with like WikiLeaks and Snowden. What do we have access to? And what does the government have the right to like look at all of our information and kind of survey us and like act as a surveillance system there? So these are really important questions to keep in mind. Yes, we have certain basic freedoms, freedom of expression in the US, but not everyone has that. And then also kind of looking at, are there certain situations that were restricted? Should we be restricted? Should we not? So it's not as kind of, we're not in this, even though we are in a very developed time period in the world, there's still people that lack basic human rights as defined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I know you guys are reading this IM law, and that's kind of an instance of like women not having equal rights and the whole issues there. So there's a lot of international relations in a lot of countries. It's really important to be aware of that and think about that and consider what rights do we have, what rights do other people have and not have in different countries, and why is that the case? Is it the government? Is it social orders? Is it that kind of thing? So it's really important, one, to not take for granted our own rights, because some people don't have the same rights that we have. But then also consider why other people don't have them, and really be aware of what the definition of rights means. And is there even something as equal rights? Can we have equal rights as a world, as a like, global population? So these are really hard questions to answer if you can answer them at all, but they're really important to keep in mind and looking forward.